June 27th, 1934, 9:42 p.m. West 142nd Street, 2 blocks from Lenox Avenue. The laughter started before the door even closed. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood in the rain, hat brim dripping, watching a white doorman lock a brass handle in his face. Inside, music thumped. Hot jazz, clinking glasses, easy joy. A sign beside the door said, "Members only." Everyone in Harlem knew what it really meant. Bumpy had come for one reason: money that was already late. The club, private, whites only, sat on black land, pulled black electricity, paid black musicians through side doors, and refused black patrons at the front. That night, the manager owed protection money, not a favor, not charity, rent for breathing safely on Harlem streets. Bumpy didn't raise his voice, he didn't threaten, he told the doorman his name. The laughter came from inside first. Then the door cracked open. The manager leaned out just enough to smirk. He was flushed with liquor, collar loose, confidence spilling out of him. He didn't pretend not to know who Bumpy was. He leaned closer and said it slow so the men behind him could hear. "You don't collect from us anymore." Behind him, 3 white men laughed. One clapped. The manager went on, "You're not welcome here, and you're not scary anymore." That was the incident. That was the line. Bumpy looked past the man, past the chandeliers, the smoke, the trumpet player blowing his lungs out, and he saw something else. Fear wasn't in the room. It had been locked out with him. The manager closed the door. The lock clicked. The laughter rose again, louder this time, sharper. A woman shrieked with delight. Someone shouted for another round. Bumpy stood there 10 seconds longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked. By 10:05 p.m., word was already moving. By midnight, everyone who mattered knew. A whites-only club had laughed at Bumpy Johnson to his face. That wasn't an insult. It was a declaration. Because protection money wasn't about muscle. It was about preventing chaos. Fires, broken bones, police raids that never ended. When a club refused to pay, they weren't saying no. They were daring the streets to decide. And the streets always answered faster than the police. By the next morning, 2 things were clear. First, Bumpy hadn't retaliated. No smashed windows, no warning shots, no mess. That silence made people nervous. Silence meant planning. Second, the club didn't back down. At 11:30 a.m., the manager doubled down. He told a reporter off the record that Harlem wouldn't dare. He said the club had friends, real ones, downtown ones. He said, "They won't touch us." That quote reached Lenox Avenue before noon. Men who made their living walking dark blocks stopped and listened. Shop owners paused with hands on cash drawers. Numbers runners went quiet. Because everyone understood the clock had started. Protection wasn't paid on a schedule. It was paid before consequences. And now there were 72 hours between laughter and whatever came next. Bumpy spent that afternoon moving through Harlem without being seen. No entourage, no speeches, just doors opening, doors closing. A nod here, a look there. At 6:18 p.m., a runner asked him one question. "You gonna let this go?" Bumpy didn't answer. That night the club filled again. Same music, same laughter, same locked door. No one inside noticed the men outside measuring exits, and no one asked the most dangerous question of all. What happens when the joke is already over, but the punchline hasn't landed yet? His name was Calvin Moore, and he had never wanted to be brave. Calvin was 32, married, 1 child, another on the way. He worked nights running inventory and cash counts for clubs that didn't want their own fingerprints on the books. Quiet work. Invisible work. The kind that kept you alive if you didn't make mistakes. The whites-only club paid him because he was careful and because he was black enough to move through Harlem without being questioned, but not loud enough to attract attention. That balance was breaking. On the morning after the laughter, Calvin woke to his wife coughing in the bathroom. Long, dry coughs that bent her forward. She tried to wave him off when he asked if she was okay. She wasn't. The doctor had already said the word sanatorium once. Another visit would make it official. Another visit meant money they didn't have. By noon, Calvin was at the club, led in through the alley like always. The manager was pacing, cigarette burning down to the filter. "You hear anything?" the man asked. Calvin shook his head. That was a lie, but not a big one. He'd heard everything and nothing. The kind of quiet that crawls. The manager leaned in. "We're not paying him. You understand that, right?" Calvin nodded again. "You're still handling the cash tonight," the manager said. "Normal operation." That was the problem. Nothing was normal. Calvin ran the numbers. The night's take would be heavy. Weekend crowd, expensive liquor, out-of-town money. If something happened, he'd be holding it. If police came, he'd be holding it. If someone from the street came asking questions, he'd be holding it. He thought of his wife, pale against the bathroom sink. He thought of the second child, still invisible but already expensive. At 3:40 p.m., Calvin felt eyes on him near Lenox Avenue. He turned. No one obvious. Just a man leaning against a storefront, not looking at anything in particular. At 4:15, another one. Same posture, different face. By 5, Calvin knew the truth he'd been avoiding. The club's refusal hadn't scared anyone away. It had painted a target on the people who couldn't say no. At 6:30 p.m., Calvin took a walk he hadn't planned. He cut through streets he normally avoided and knocked on a door he hadn't touched in years. A small apartment, 2nd floor. No sign. The man who opened it didn't smile. "You lost?" he asked. Calvin swallowed. "I need to speak to Mr. Johnson." The door stayed open. That alone felt dangerous. Inside, the room was bare. 1 table, 2 chairs. No wasted space. Bumpy Johnson stood near the window, looking out, not turning around. Calvin spoke fast. He explained the money, the pressure, the manager's decision. He didn't beg. He didn't accuse. He just laid the facts down like cards. When he finished, the room stayed quiet. Finally, Bumpy turned. "You work there tonight?" he asked. "Yes." "You handle the money?" "Yes." Bumpy nodded once. "Then you're in the middle whether you like it or not." Calvin felt something drop in his chest. "I didn't choose this." "No," Bumpy said. "But you're standing in it." Calvin took a breath. "I have a wife. She's sick. If I lose this job..." Bumpy cut him off. "If you keep it, you might lose more." There it was. The choice Calvin had been circling all day now spoken out loud. Loyalty to the club that paid him, or survival in a neighborhood that didn't forget insults. Bumpy stepped closer. Not threatening, just certain. "Go to work tonight," he said. "Do exactly what you're told." Calvin frowned. "Then what?" Bumpy held his gaze. "Then decide who you're really working for." That night, as Calvin walked back toward the club, he noticed something else. The men from earlier weren't leaning anymore. They were watching the door, and the clock had less than 48 hours left. Friday night came heavy. By 8:10 p.m., the club was full. Jackets off. ties loosened. The band pushed faster, louder, filling the room so no one had to think. The manager stood near the bar, smiling too hard, shaking hands like a man proving something to himself. Calvin stayed near the back office, counting. Stacks of bills, neat and warm from hands that didn't worry about tomorrow. Every 20 minutes he checked the alley through a slit in the door. Nothing obvious, no crowds, no noise. That was worse. At 9:05, a runner slipped inside, white, nervous, pretending to look for the restroom. He whispered something to the bartender, who stiffened and glanced toward the back. The manager followed, face tightening. "You hear anything?" he demanded. Calvin shook his head. "Truth this time." The manager leaned in. "Good, because we got coverage tonight, real coverage." Calvin didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. At 9:30, 2 uniformed police officers appeared at the front. They weren't responding to anything. They were there to be seen. The manager laughed louder, bought them drinks, slapped one on the back. "You see?" he said to no one in particular. "All noise, no teeth." Calvin's hands trembled as he wrapped the cash. He'd seen this before, men mistaken a pause for safety. At 10:12, the power flickered. Just a blink. Long enough for a few laughs, a joke about the wiring. Then it steadied. The band kept playing. Calvin felt his stomach tighten. Power outages didn't happen by accident. Not on this block. Not like that. At 10:25, one of the officers stepped out to smoke. He didn't come back. At 10:40, the second officer followed. The manager didn't notice. He was too busy celebrating being right. At 10:47, the band stopped mid-song. Not because of the power. Because the drummer dropped his sticks and stared toward the back. Calvin heard the alley door open. Slow, deliberate. No shouting, no rush. Footsteps, heavy, controlled. The manager turned, annoyance flashing across his face. "What the hell is this?" No one answered. Men entered the room one by one, not many, 4, maybe 5, all dressed plain, all calm. The room shifted, conversations died. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Calvin's heart hammered. He knew faces now. Men who didn't speak unless something was already decided. One of them looked straight at him. Just a look. Nothing more. The manager stepped forward, trying to laugh. "This is a private..." A hand went up. Not aggressive, final. "Everyone stays seated," the man said. Quiet voice, not raised. The manager froze. "This isn't necessary," he said. "We're protected." The man tilted his head. "We know." Calvin felt the room tilt. Protected, that word again. From the corner of his eye, Calvin saw movement near the bar, someone reaching down, too fast, too nervous. A shot cracked the air, not inside, outside. The sound bounced through the walls, sharp and unmistakable. A woman screamed. The men inside didn't flinch. One of them spoke again. "Nobody move." The manager's face went pale. "You can't do this. The police..." Another shot. Closer this time. Calvin's breath caught. He knew then this wasn't a warning. It wasn't theater. This was the moment when choices turned permanent. The man near Calvin leaned closer. Low voice. "Back office," he said. "Now." Calvin hesitated. The manager stared at him, eyes wide, pleading and furious all at once. If Calvin moved, he was choosing. If he stayed, he was still choosing. He thought of his wife's cough, the doctor's eyes, the second child that didn't know any of this was happening. Calvin picked up the cash box and stepped away from the manager. No one stopped him. As he walked toward the back, he realized something too late. The manager wasn't the target tonight, and neither was the money. So why did it feel like someone had already betrayed them both? The back office smelled like ink and metal. Calvin shut the door behind him, hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped the cash box. The walls were thin. He could hear the club breathing, chairs scraping, whispers breaking, someone crying into a napkin. A man stepped in behind him and closed the door again. Not one of Bumpy's. Calvin recognized him immediately. Eddie Marks. The club's insurance. Eddie wasn't a cop. He was worse. He wore tailored suits and carried favors instead of a badge. He made problems disappear by moving them sideways. Downtown connections, uptown leverage. Eddie smiled like they were old friends. "Easy," Eddie said. "You look like you're about to make a mistake." Calvin swallowed. "I'm just doing my job." Eddie glanced at the cash box. "That's the thing. Tonight your job changed." Calvin's chest tightened. "I don't understand." Eddie leaned against the desk, calm, comfortable. "This whole thing, the laughter, the refusal, the noise?" He waved a hand. "It wasn't stupidity." Calvin stared. "Then what was it?" A pause. Long enough to hurt. "Bait." The word landed heavy. Eddie continued. "Johnson doesn't move unless he thinks he has to. So we gave him something public, something he couldn't ignore." Calvin felt cold. "You set this up." "Of course we did." Eddie shrugged, and he walked right into it. Outside, another sound. Metal scraping pavement. Not gunfire. Something else. Eddie watched Calvin carefully. Here's what happens next. His men make a show. Maybe rough up a few people. Maybe break a leg. Enough to remind everyone who they think runs the street. Calvin shook his head. "This isn't a show. Someone's going to die." Eddie's smile thinned. "Only if he doesn't listen." Calvin whispered, "Listen to what?" "That the rules changed." Eddie stepped closer. "Downtown wants Harlem quiet, predictable. Clubs like this bring money without headlines. Johnson brings headlines." Calvin's mouth went dry. "So you laugh at him?" "We humiliate him," Eddie corrected. "Then we document his response." Calvin felt the floor tilt. "Document?" Eddie tapped his jacket. "Affidavits, witnesses, statements from scared white patrons, from tonight." He smiled again. "From you, if you want to keep your job." Calvin stared at him. "You want me to testify against him?" "Not testify," Eddie said. "Just tell the truth. He sent men. Shots were fired. People were terrified." Calvin's hands clenched. "You fired those shots." Eddie didn't deny it. Outside, a scream cut short. Calvin rushed to the door. Eddie caught his arm. Hard. "Don't," Eddie said. "You don't want to see the rest yet." Calvin yanked free and cracked the door open. The room was chaos. Chairs overturned. People herded low. One of Bumpy's men stood near the front, blood running down his sleeve. The drummer lay on the floor clutching his leg. That wasn't supposed to happen. The man in charge, Bumpy's man, was shouting now. "We're leaving, now." Too fast, too sudden. And then the real twist hit. From the alley came a flood of sound. Boots. Many boots. Organized. Police. Not 2 officers, not 4. A squad. Sirens stayed off, but the message was clear. Eddie leaned close to Calvin's ear. "There it is." Calvin's mind raced. This wasn't a response. This was timing. The door at the front slammed open. Uniforms poured in. Guns out. Orders barked. "Hands where we can see them." Bumpy's men froze. Too clean. Too rehearsed. One officer grabbed the wounded man. Another kicked the drummer's hands away from his leg. The manager reappeared, shaking, playing his role perfectly. They stormed the place. We were afraid for our lives. Calvin backed into the office, heart pounding. Eddie followed him in, satisfied. You see? He overplayed it. Now it's on record. Calvin shook his head. You planned the police. Of course. What if someone died? Eddie's eyes hardened. Then Johnson would be finished faster. Calvin's voice broke. You used all of us. Eddie shrugged. That's business. A knock on the door. Firm. Eddie opened it to a uniformed officer. We're good here. The officer nodded. One thing, he said. Johnson himself? Eddie smiled. Not here. The officer cursed under his breath. That was when Calvin realized the second layer of the trap. Bumpy wasn't supposed to be there. He never was. This wasn't about catching Bumpy. It was about forcing him to move next. As the police led men out in cuffs, Eddie turned to Calvin. You still have a choice, he said. Tell them what they need. Or get buried between sides. Calvin looked at the cash box on the desk. The money nobody cared about anymore. Outside, sirens finally screamed to life. And somewhere across Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was learning that his silence had been anticipated. The trap hadn't failed. It had just shifted. So now the question wasn't whether Bumpy would respond. It was who would still be standing when he did. By 2:30 a.m., the club was empty. Chairs overturned. Glass crushed into the floor. The band gone. The laughter erased so completely it felt imaginary. Police tape cut the room into useless pieces. Calvin sat on a folding chair in the alley, wrapped in a borrowed coat, watching officers carry evidence bags past him. No one asked about the money. That alone told him everything. Eddie stood nearby, speaking quietly to a detective, nodding at the right moments. When it was done, he walked back over like this was just another transaction. They'll want your statement in the morning, Eddie said. Nothing long. Calvin stared at his hands. And if I don't? Eddie's voice stayed level. Then the club closes. You lose the job. The hospital bills don't stop. And the street won't protect someone who didn't choose. Calvin felt hollow. You already decided. Everyone decides, Eddie said. Some just pretend they didn't. At dawn, Calvin went home. His wife was awake, sitting up, wrapped in a blanket. Her cough rattled her chest. She looked at his face and knew something had broken. Are you safe? She asked. He nodded. It wasn't a lie, not exactly. By noon, the story was everywhere. Headlines talked about gang violence, black intimidation. A near riot prevented by police action. No mention of laughter, no mention of bait. 3 of Bumpy's men were charged. 1 would never walk right again. The drummer lost his job and his leg never healed properly. The club reopened a week later under new management. Calvin went in for a statement. He told them what Eddie told him to tell them. Each word felt like a nail. That night, Bumpy Johnson sent for him. No threats, no shouting, just a message. Calvin went. Bumpy listened, didn't interrupt, didn't argue. When Calvin finished, Bumpy nodded slowly. You did what you thought you had to, he said. Calvin waited for anger. It didn't come. Instead, Bumpy asked one question. Did it help? Calvin thought of the hospital bills paid, the club job secure, his wife breathing easier, at least for now. Yes, he said. For my family? Bumpy stood, walked to the window, looked out at Harlem waking up. Then understand this, he said. You weren't the cost. Calvin frowned. Then who was? Bumpy turned back, eyes hard. The next man who thinks laughter is enough. Calvin left with his stomach tight. because something else had changed. The street was quieter. Not safer, not calmer, just quieter. And everyone knew, quiet like that never lasted, it only meant someone was counting. And counting always ended with subtraction. Harlem didn't explode. That's what surprised everyone. No fires, no public retaliation, no bodies in the gutter to balance the scale. For 2 full weeks, nothing happened at all. The clubs kept playing. The numbers runners kept running. Men who'd been loud went quiet. Men who'd been quiet started watching corners longer than necessary. Because the message was wrong. The whites-only club thought they'd proven something. Downtown thought they'd drawn a line. Even the newspapers thought the story was finished. The street didn't. What the street felt was absence. Bumpy Johnson stopped appearing. Not at card tables, not at nightclubs, not walking Lenox like he used to. His name was still spoken, but always in the past tense, like something that might not answer if called. That scared people more than violence. Then the math started changing. A bar on 138th Street missed its liquor delivery, no explanation. Just didn't come. A policy runner found his route doubled overnight. New faces claiming corners that had never been contested before. A white-owned club downtown lost its band when the musicians quit together. Same night. No coordination anyone could prove. Small things. Unconnected on paper. But Harlem wasn't built on paper. It was built on memory. And memory said this wasn't retreat. It was rearrangement. Calvin felt it most at work. The club reopened, polished and careful. New manager, new rules, same money. But the alley felt wrong. Men lingered too long. Conversation stopped when Calvin passed. Once he found the back door unlocked when he knew he'd secured it. Eddie stopped visiting. That bothered Calvin more than if he had. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon, a man Calvin had never seen before took the seat across from him at a diner. Didn't order. Just placed a matchbook on the table. No logo. No writing. "Mr. Johnson wants you to have that," the man said. Calvin stared. "Why?" The man shrugged. "So you remember which door opens." That night, the whites-only club lost power again. This time, it didn't come back on. The fire inspector arrived fast, faster than usual. He cited wiring issues, safety concerns, temporary closure, temporary stretched into permanent. Downtown investors pulled out quietly. The manager disappeared from the city. No forwarding address, no violence, no arrests, just subtraction. Calvin stood across the street the night the doors finally stayed locked. No laughter this time, no music. Just a dark building that had once believed it was untouchable. He realized then the real aftershock wasn't fear, it was uncertainty. No one knew what the rules were anymore, and that was worse. Because when rules dissolve, everyone starts guessing. And guesses get people hurt. As Calvin walked away, he understood something he hadn't that first night in the rain. The laughter hadn't been punished. It had been remembered. And memory in Harlem was patient. So patient that by the time you felt its hand on your shoulder, it was already too late to ask why. Calvin never worked another club after that. Not because he was pushed out. Because the offers stopped. People still nodded when they saw him. Still said his name, still asked about his wife's health. But doors closed a half second sooner than they used to. He paid the hospital bills. His wife recovered enough to stay home. Their second child was born healthy, loud, demanding, everything a newborn should be. And yet, something was gone. One night, years later, Calvin walked past the old building. The sign had been stripped, the windows boarded. A new church met there on Sundays, folding chairs, soft hymns, a different kind of silence. He stood across the street and thought about that first laugh. How light it sounded, how easy, and he understood the final irony. The club lost everything it tried to protect. The street lost men who never came back, and Calvin lost the one thing no one ever warned him about, being trusted by no side at all. He reached into his coat pocket and felt the matchbook. Still there, still blank. A door that had opened once and never again. If this story held you, stay with us. The next one costs even more.